Hi, third grade teachers. My name's Kelly, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Forced Migration Unit for third grade social studies. This unit includes 11 lessons plus 6 optional ones and takes 13 to 14 days to complete. In this unit, students are focusing on how oppression can force people to move or stay in a location. We're going to look at the U.S. government policies against Native Americans, as well as the start of enslavement in the Americas. In continuing with the discussion on enslavement, we'll also look at how it came to an end via the Underground Railroad, escape methods, and the Civil War. Then students have some time to learn a little bit about what happened after the Civil War, looking at sharecropping, and finding out about the Great Migration, which was when many African Americans moved away from the South after the Civil War. There is a slideshow that goes along with the Forced Migration Unit. Our compelling question is, how does oppression force people to either stay or move? Then we have 3 supporting questions. What happens when cultures collide? What was enslavement and how did people stop it? And what was the Great Migration and why did it happen? Chapter 1 is entitled Collision of Cultures, and this used to be at the end of the migration unit, but is moved here as it fits better with the concept of forced migration and oppression. In this chapter, we're going to look about Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. So lesson 1, we start with a review of westward expansion from the migration unit. So you can reference the Manifest Destiny photo, you can look at the tribal map or images of Native Americans, or any of the images of the gold miner, covered wagon, or transcontinental railroad. Remind students about the theme of immigration and migration, why people move. Is it because they want to or because they have to? And that's going to get us into this question of oppression. We're going to need to define the word oppression and emphasize that it is not fair, it's unjust, or it's going to be cruel. You can ask students if they can think of examples of oppression, or we can just say that some things happened in our country and we're going to learn how oppression was a part of that. In lesson 2, we learn about the Trail of Tears. Please note that this is not an incredibly long lesson. Students, again, are going to dig into this more in 5th grade and much more in 8th grade. This is meant to be an overview with the concept of oppression and getting students to see how it was unfair that the government forced Native Americans to move out of their homes, off their lands, to an area that might not have been as helpful to their way of life. So we have a picture to look at, which is a pretty common image from the Trail of Tears. We have a map that we can look at, and there's a video as well as some reading information if needed. When you finish lesson 2, that's a good time to do the formative, which is simply to write a response to the supporting question. Chapter 2 is entitled Enslavement. It is important that we use the term enslavement instead of slavery. Enslavement means these people were forced into it, and it puts the blame on the people who did the enslaving, not the people who were forced into it. We would also say enslaved person, not slave, and you could say enslaver rather than slave owner. It's important to use these terms rather than the old ones, as it really does place the blame onto those who did the actions, not those who were victimized by the actions. Just a special note for this section, please do not do any sort of reenacting or simulation of enslavement. It's not necessary for student understanding, nor is it a good choice. There's an optional lesson right at the forefront if you'd like to do a timeline to help students place when this is happening. In lesson 3, students will look at this image and complete a KWL or other graphic organizer. Students can explain what they think they notice, and then you can do a little bit further exploration if there's time. Lesson 4, we're talking about enslavement in terms of what it was and how people tried to stop it. There are 3 images that students can explore. This first one is people on what was called a slave ship. So I would just call it a ship where they're being brought across to be sold into enslavement. Then we have a picture of an auction where enslaved people are being sold, or those who were captured on the ship are being sold into enslavement. And then we have a picture of a family on a plantation. While you're looking through these pictures, make sure you talk about how human resources, meaning labor, were used to produce goods, particularly cotton. There's an interactive map that you can watch that moves through the years and represents a number of people who were brought from Africa to North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And then lesson 5, we start looking at fighting back. So what people did to try and stop enslavement. There's information on 3 different areas: escaping, Underground Railroad, and abolitionists. You'll want to do at least one resource from each one in order for students to have a good understanding of all the different methods that people tried to do to stop enslavement. In lesson 6, we have ending enslavement. So we have some information on the Civil War. Again, this is hit very hard in 5th grade and again in 8th grade. So just keep this as a brief overview. We start with explaining we have the two sides concerning enslavement on whether or not it should be allowed, and then an explanation that we have free states versus slave states, meaning where enslavement was legal. And then we look at some of the different people who helped fight in the war, including African Americans. And then we move into a little bit of information on the 3 main amendments that came out of the Civil War. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th, figuring out what they did to help end enslavement and then give better rights to those who were formerly enslaved. Chapter 3 is about oppression and migration, and we're talking about the Great Migration. So we start by looking at this picture, and students will probably note that it looks a lot like the cotton field picture that took place during enslavement, versus right now the years show that this was not during the time of enslavement. It was in fact after the Civil War ended. And so this could move into a conversation on sharecropping. There's a series of images to look at concerning sharecropping. You can work through them as a group. You can work through them in small groups or with partner work. And then we're going to want to work on the financial literacy standards at that point. And there is an ISU financial literacy lesson that can help support the learning there. It helps explain why so many people were stuck as sharecroppers, because they didn't have the ability to save enough money in that system in order to get out and away from it. And in lesson 8, we learn about segregation. There's a few images to use. You can see that there are 3 that are marked as recommended to help students see some of the ways that people were segregated. Again, this is a topic that is covered in 5th grade, so just keep it as a brief overview and use those resources to open up an opportunity for a little bit of discussion. Lesson 9, we get into the Great Migration, and we understand a little bit about how Jim Crow laws impacted that. You can see there are a few resources recommended, and there's another one available. Lesson 10 is the summative and explaining how oppression forces people to either stay in their spots, like sharecropping, or move, like the Trail of Tears and enslavement. It's recommended that you keep the focus on after the Civil War when segregation was happening and how that led to the Great Migration. But again, students could talk about any of the other items covered in the unit. I hope this video was helpful as you prepare to teach the forced migration unit. As always, please reach out to your PLC leader, instructional coach, or curriculum facilitator if you have any questions or in need of any additional support.